In a world where arrogance rules and empathy is rare, one powerful man dares to humiliate a simple waitress in front of his deaf daughter. But what happens next turns humiliation into history. Stay tuned till the end and don't forget to subscribe to Simply Stories, where every tale reminds you that justice never stays silent at the heart of Manhattan's glittering skyline. Where crystal chandeliers dripped with light and silverware shimmered like stars, stood the Golden Crown. A restaurant that served the city's richest, and sometimes its cruelest. Tonight, the air buzzed with laughter from polished lips and the faint chime of champagne flutes. Every table held power, arrogance, and a touch of performance. But at the center of it all sat a man who seemed to own the room, the billionaire whose name opened doors and shut down conversations. He was used to being obeyed, admired, feared, and tonight he wanted entertainment. Across from him sat his teenage daughter, her delicate hands folded in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between her father and the untouched plate before her. She was deaf, something he treated less like a trait and more like a personal embarrassment. Every time she tried to sign to him, he waved her off or laughed it away. Communication between them was a chasm filled with silence and misunderstanding. And tonight, that silence was about to be exploited. The waitress who approached their table was new, young, graceful, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that stood out even in her simple uniform. She smiled politely, not realizing she was stepping into a storm. The billionaire looked up from his glass of wine, his tone dripping with arrogance as he said, "You see my daughter here? If you can actually talk to her, I'll give you $50,000. Right here. Right now." The entire restaurant froze. Forks stopped clinking. Conversations faded into whispers. All eyes turned to the table, to the girl who couldn't hear, and the man who thought humiliation was entertainment. The waitress blinked, her expression unreadable. It was clear the challenge wasn't kindness. It was mockery. He wasn't testing her skill. He was testing her worth. For a moment, she said nothing. She could feel the weight of the room pressing on her chest, the stares of the elite slicing through her like knives. A few people smirked, eager to see her fumble. The mater d' shifted uncomfortably, afraid of what might come next. But instead of shrinking, the waitress slowly set her tray down, smoothed the front of her apron, and looked directly at the man's daughter. Then, with gentle precision, her hands began to move. At first, the gestures were soft, uncertain to the untrained eye, but fluid and full of meaning. "Hello," she signed. Asterisk, "How are you?" The billionaire's daughter's eyes widened. She hesitated, then responded hesitantly with her own hands. Asterisk, sign language. Asterisk, the waitress smiled, her movements warm and effortless. "Yes, I learned for someone I care about." Gasps spread through the restaurant as realization rippled across the tables. The young waitress wasn't bluffing. She was fluent. Her expressions were calm but alive, her fingers flowing gracefully through the language of silence. The billionaire's daughter suddenly straightened in her chair, her lips trembling as she signed back faster, her emotions spilling over. Asterisk, "You can understand me?" she asked. Every word the waitress signed, her eyes kind and unwavering. Tears began to roll down the girl's cheeks. For the first time that night, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't a problem to be ignored. She was asterisk-heard. The billionaire watched in stunned silence as his daughter laughed in honest. Bright laugh that turned heads and reached out to touch the waitress's hand in gratitude. The waitress squeezed her fingers gently, assigning one more sentence. Asterisk, "You're not alone tonight." Asterisk, it was such a simple phrase, yet it carried the weight of years of isolation, misunderstanding, and neglect. The father's smirk faded, his confidence cracking. Around him, the diners exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the cruel spectacle had turned into something far more human. The humiliation he had planned for the waitress had transformed into his own silent defeat. He tried to mask his discomfort with a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Didn't expect that, but his voice lacked its usual dominance. The control he prided himself on was slipping. For the first time, his daughter wasn't looking at him for approval. She was looking at the waitress with admiration, hope, and connection. As the waitress stepped back, she offered a small nod to the girl and picked up her tray again. But before turning away, she paused just long enough to meet the father's gaze. There was no anger in her expression, only quiet strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. She had accepted his cruel challenge not to earn his money, but to remind him and everyone watching that humanity cannot be bought or mocked. The whispers returned as she walked away, every head in the restaurant turning to follow her. Some clapped softly, others looked down in shame. The billionaire sat frozen, his jaw tight, his eyes following the waitress as if trying to understand what had just happened. For years, he had lived in a world where wealth was power. But tonight, power had worn an apron and carried plates with grace. His daughter watched the waitress go, her tears still glistening under the golden light. She signed softly to herself, repeating the words the waitress had given her: "You're not alone tonight." For the first time, the sentence felt real, and as the music resumed and conversations cautiously restarted, the billionaire couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something far greater than a trick. He had witnessed a truth. That night, the Golden Crown, a place built on luxury and ego, had been silenced by kindness. And somewhere deep in the billionaire's chest, a discomfort began to grow. He didn't yet understand it, but soon that same waitress would uncover a secret that would shake his world far beyond embarrassment. Because she wasn't just a waitress, she had come to this place for a reason, and the night was far from over. The moment the waitress stepped away from the table, the billionaire's forced grin dissolved into a scowl. His pride, polished and fragile, had been cracked in front of the city's elite. The applause, the murmurs, the looks of quiet judgment, they all clawed at his ego. He slammed his hand against the table, startling his daughter and drawing the attention of nearby guests. "Enough of this nonsense," he hissed. "She's just a waitress. Those tricks don't mean anything." His voice carried across the room, sharp and cold, cutting through the soft music like glass. The daughter flinched, shrinking into her seat, her trembling hands instinctively rising to sign something, but she stopped halfway, as if afraid to finish. Her father's glare hardened. "Don't do that," he snapped. "I told you, stop with those hand gestures, you don't need them. You need to learn to be normal." The waitress, standing a few feet away pretending to clear a nearby table, had seen it all. The daughter's lip quivered as she blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. When the waitress returned quietly to refill their water, the girl caught her gaze, desperation flickering in her eyes. She began signing discreetly under the table, her movements small, nervous. "He hates it when I sign," she confessed. "He says it makes me weak." The waitress's heart clenched. She lowered her eyes briefly to hide the emotion rising in her chest. Then she signed back gently, her expression soft but firm. "He's wrong. There's nothing weak about being different. The only weakness is not listening." The girl's breathing steadied, her trembling hands slowing. For the first time she smiled against. Fragile, but real. The billionaire glanced up from his phone, his annoyance radiating like heat. "Enough chatting," he barked. "Go do your job." The waitress nodded politely, her face calm, but her eyes told another story. She turned and walked toward the restroom, each step echoing against the marble floor. Behind that calm exterior, storms of memory churned. Inside the restroom, under the harsh white light, she finally exhaled. Her hands shook as she gripped the sink, her reflection staring back at her, reflection she barely recognized anymore. Years of exhaustion and quiet pain had carved themselves into her face, but beneath it all, her eyes still held the same fire that once fueled her dreams. She remembered the courtroom, the podium, the day she stood tall as a law graduate who believed justice could protect the vulnerable. She remembered her sister, bright, mischievous, and deaf since birth. The girl who taught her the beauty of silence and expression, the sister who laughed with her through endless nights, signing stories no one else could hear. But that laughter had been silenced 5 years ago on a cold hospital night. Her sister had gone in for a simple procedure, terrified and unable to communicate. There was no interpreter. The doctors ignored her signs, misunderstood her pain, dismissed her panic as confusion. By the time anyone realized she was in distress, it was too late. The machine had flatlined. Her sister's hands, those small, expressive hands, had gone still. The waitress pressed a trembling palm against her reflection, her eyes glassy. That night had broken her, but not in the way the world expected. She had spent months fighting the hospital, filing lawsuits, standing in courtrooms that reeked of privilege and excuses. But money spoke louder than truth. The lawyers she once admired laughed behind closed doors. Her career was destroyed, her savings drained. No one wanted to hire a woman who had challenged the powerful. So she disappeared. Took a job in the shadows, serving the very people who built their empires on silence. For 5 long years, she endured insults disguised as jokes. Racist remarks disguised as banter, and pity disguised as kindness. But every night, after the last guest left, she wrote. She documented, recorded, names, transactions, abuses, all hidden behind the walls of luxury. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was an observer, a witness, a survivor collecting proof. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, breaking the spell. She pulled it out and stared at the message draft she'd been typing for weeks. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she finally typed 2 simple words. Time. Her heart pounded as she hit send. Somewhere beyond the restaurant walls, system she had quietly built was waking up an ally she trusted, ready to act just then. The restroom door swung open. The manager entered, his expression tight and condescending. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "You think that performance was cute? You embarrassed a very important client tonight." She straightened slowly, drying her hands with measured calm. The manager crossed his arms, lowering his voice. "Apologize. Right now, go to his table and say you were out of line, or I'll make sure you never work in this city again." The waitress smiled faintly, slipping her phone back into her pocket. Her voice was steady, almost serene. "Don't worry," she said softly. "Everything's about to change." He frowned, confused by the quiet certainty in her tone. She walked past him, her composure unshaken, her eyes sharp and alive. The music outside had shifted, something slower, heavier. The hum of conversation had dimmed. The world outside that restroom door didn't know it yet. But the balance of power was about to tilt as she stepped back into the golden glow of the dining room. All eyes seemed to turn toward her. The billionaire was laughing again, performing for his audience, pretending the earlier humiliation had never happened. But beneath his arrogance, there was a crack, a sliver of unease he couldn't quite shake. The waitress adjusted her apron, her every movement deliberate. Her phone buzzed again. One new message, a single line: "We're ready when you are." She looked toward the billionaire's table, and toward the daughter, who was now staring back at her with quiet curiosity and trust. The waitress smiled gently and began walking forward, every step echoing with quiet purpose. The game he started wasn't over. It had just begun, and by the time this night ended, the man who thought he could buy dignity would learn the price of silence. By the time the clock struck 9, the golden crown had transformed into a spectacle of wealth and arrogance. The billionaire had summoned his circle, powerful friends draped in silk and ego, the kind of people whose smiles were as sharp as their business deals. Senators, investors, and real estate magnates filled the room, their laughter loud, their drinks expensive, their morals non-existent. He wanted witnesses not to dinner, but to domination. The waitress, he decided, would be humiliated properly this time in front of the people who mattered most to him. He sat back in his chair, surrounded by flashing watches and clinking glasses. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a smirk that reeked of pride, "you might have heard about our little show earlier. Our lovely waitress here thinks she's smarter than me, thinks she can outshine her betters." He gestured toward her like she was an exhibit, not a person. The crowd chuckled, eager to see the next act in his cruelty. "But I promise you," he continued, "by the end of tonight, she won't just lose her job, she'll be lucky if she ever finds one again in Manhattan." The waitress stood silently near the table, her expression unreadable. The daughter sat nearby, her hands twisting nervously, eyes darting between her father and the woman who had shown her kindness. The billionaire leaned closer, his tone dripping with venom. "So tell me," he sneered, "how does it feel to be nothing more than a servant pretending to be special?" The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, bouncing off the marble walls. But when the noise finally died down, the waitress stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "If I remember correctly," she said softly, "you offered me $50,000 earlier. Let's make it an even 100. The room erupted in disbelief. The laughter returned, louder than before. "You," the billionaire scoffed, "double the bet. With what money?" Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Oh, I'm not betting with money," she replied. "I'm betting with truth." For a moment, silence hovered over the table like smoke. The billionaire frowned, thrown off by her composure. What the hell does that mean? Before she could answer, the grand doors of the Golden Crown swung open with a force that drew every eye in the room. The maître d' froze mid-step as a tall man in a dark tailored suit strode in, his presence commanding attention like thunder in a clear sky. The crowd's whispers turned into murmurs of disbelief. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered a name, Dr. Marcus Jefferson, a legend in the world of civil rights law. The man who had taken down corporations, mayors, and entire government departments for discrimination. His mere arrival was enough to silence the room. He walked with confidence toward the billionaire's table, his gaze sharp but calm. Without waiting for permission, he pulled out a chair and sat down right across from the billionaire, next to the waitress. "Good evening," Jefferson said smoothly, his deep voice echoing through the tension. "I hope I'm not interrupting your entertainment." The billionaire's smirk faltered. "Marcus Jefferson," he said, forcing a laugh. "Didn't expect to see you in a place like this?" "Oh, I've been meaning to drop by," Jefferson replied, glancing toward the waitress. "I had an appointment with a friend." The billionaire frowned. "Friend?" Jefferson turned slightly, his eyes meeting the waitress's. "Dr. Williams," he said with quiet pride, "you've done more than anyone expected." The room erupted in gasps. The billionaire's expression froze. "What did you call her?" he demanded. "Dr. Kesha Williams," Jefferson repeated calmly. "Harvard law graduate, former civil rights attorney, undercover investigator for workplace discrimination and human rights violations. You didn't really think she was just a waitress, did you?" The color drained from the billionaire's face. Around him, his friends exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter dying in their throats. The cameras in their pockets began recording discreetly. The daughter's eyes widened with disbelief and pride. The waitress, no. Dr. Williams finally spoke, her tone calm but edged with truth. "For 5 years, I've worked in your restaurants, your hotels, your clubs. I've seen the things you try to hide. The way your staff is treated, the wages you've stolen, the silence you've forced on those too afraid to speak. But I wasn't afraid." From her apron, she pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. Instantly, a projector hidden in the restaurant ceiling came to life, casting bright light across the wall. Images and recordings filled the screen, employees crying as they described harassment, security footage of illegal firings, conversations between executives mocking disabled workers. Every secret, every act of cruelty laid bare. "You think you own everything you touch," Dr. Williams said quietly. "But you can't buy truth." The billionaire shot to his feet. "Turn that off," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "You can't do this. You can't use stolen footage." Jefferson leaned back calmly, a knowing smirk on his face. "Actually, she can. Everything here was gathered under federal supervision. You see, you've been under investigation for months." As if on cue, the restaurant doors opened again. This time, it wasn't lawyers or tycoons. It was men and women in dark suits, badges gleaming under the chandelier light. Gasps and shouts erupted as federal agents entered, their presence commanding instant silence. One of them stepped forward, flashing a badge. "FBI?" she announced firmly. "Everyone, stay seated." The billionaire stumbled back, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is a mistake," he shouted. "You can't arrest me in my own restaurant?" The agent looked unimpressed. "Oh, we can," she replied. especially when your manager here has been working with us all along." All eyes turned to the manager, who stepped forward slowly, removing his name tag to reveal a badge underneath. The billionaire's jaw dropped. The room broke into chaos, guests whispering, cameras flashing, the walls closing in around him. Dr. Williams stood perfectly still, her expression calm amid the storm. Jefferson looked at her with quiet admiration. "You did it," he murmured. The billionaire tried to protest, but his voice drowned under the weight of his crumbling empire. Every screen, every phone, every eye in that room had turned against him. Years of corruption were unraveling before him, live and unstoppable. And as the agents moved closer, the waitress who once stood silent and invisible finally looked him in the eye and said, softly but clearly, "You should have listened when you had the chance." The room fell silent once more. The man who thought himself untouchable was finally surrounded not by wealth or applause, but by truth. And as he was led away, his empire began to collapse piece by piece, right before the very people he'd once ruled with arrogance. The restaurant that once glittered with gold and arrogance had fallen silent. The laughter of the powerful had been replaced by the echo of truth, raw and undeniable. The billionaire, once untouchable, now sat surrounded by agents, the flashing lights of cameras capturing every inch of his downfall. His face red with anger and disbelief, twisted as recordings of his voice filled the speakers, mocking his employees, silencing complaints, laughing at the struggles of the deaf and the poor. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his empire. The people who had once toasted to his brilliance now lowered their eyes, afraid to be associated with him. Senators who had shared his table quietly deleted his number. Business partners turned away, pretending they hadn't laughed along with his cruelty. The empire that had been built on humiliation and silence was crumbling before the world's gaze. And amidst the wreckage stood Dr. Williams, calm and unshaken. The woman once dismissed as invisible had become the voice of justice itself. Her quiet strength filled the room, not with noise, but with presence. She didn't gloat, didn't smile at his downfall, because this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about truth being heard. Finally and completely, the billionaire's daughter watched everything unfold, her eyes brimming with tears. For years she had lived in a prison of silence, taught to hide her hands, her language, her very identity. Now she lifted those same hands, not to hide, but to speak. The room turned as her fingers began to move, trembling but sure. She signed to her father, her expression both broken and resolute. She told him she was ashamed of his name, that for the first time in her life, she was proud not of her wealth, not of her privilege, but of the woman who had defended her right to exist. The cameras caught her tears as she stood beside Dr. Williams, her small frame radiating the kind of courage her father had never known. 6 months later, the world had changed. The billionaire's name, once carved into towers and luxury brands, had become synonymous with disgrace. His empire was dismantled piece by piece, his assets frozen, his associates fleeing the light they once worshipped. He lived now in isolation alone, in a modest, fading estate that echoed with memories of power lost. The silence that once belonged to his daughter now belonged to him. No servants, no friends, no noise, only the hollow reminder of the man he used to be. He read about her in the papers sometimes, unable to look away. The daughter he had silenced was now a symbol of everything he had denied. And in every photograph, beside her, was the woman who had changed her life forever. Dr. Kesha Williams had become a national name. News networks called her the woman who taught America that silence can fight back. She was no longer a hidden observer in the shadows of the elite. She was a full partner at the civil rights firm that had helped her bring down one of the city's most powerful men. Her speeches filled auditoriums, her presence inspired thousands. But she remained the same woman who once held trembling hands in comfort, who believed that justice was not about destroying people lit, was about rebuilding what cruelty had broken. The billionaire's daughter followed her path with renewed purpose. She had enrolled in a deaf academy, surrounded by students who spoke her language finally, freely, joyfully. Every day, she used her hands not with shame, but with pride. Her voice, though silent, now carried farther than her father's fortune ever did. She became a youth activist, speaking through sign to advocate for accessibility, empathy, and inclusion. Her confidence grew, her spirit unbound from fear. She visited hospitals, schools, and government offices, demanding interpreters and equal treatment for every deaf child who had once been ignored, and when her father's remaining fortune was legally transferred to Harmony, that once silenced others. She made a decision that would redefine its legacy. She created the Williams Blackstone Foundation for Deaf Justice. The name alone was a statement, uniting her father's downfall with her mentor's triumph. The foundation funded sign language education, interpreter programs, and scholarships for students with disabilities. Every dollar that had once bought silence now fueled voices that demanded change. Dr. Williams stood beside her at the foundation's launch, watching the girl who had once been a frightened child at a dinner table now lead a movement with grace. The cameras flashed, capturing the two women together, teacher and student, survivor and savior, justice and hope. Reporters called it poetic. The billionaire's daughter called it redemption. Months later, in a quiet courtroom, she took one final step. Before a judge, she signed her new name into the legal record. No longer a black stone, the name that had symbolized greed and control. From that day forward, she was Williams. Not by blood, but by choice. The same name as the woman who had stood up for her when no one else did. The woman who had turned pain into purpose and silence into strength. Outside the courthouse, she stood before a sea of cameras, signing her message for the world to see. Her movements were steady, her expression serene. She spoke of her father not with hatred, but with sorrow. She said that forgiveness wasn't forgetting, it was refusing to let cruelty define who you become. She said that silence can be strength when it's chosen and not forced. And she said that justice, when served with compassion, can transform even the darkest story into light. As she finished, Dr. Williams placed a hand on her shoulder, and the crowd erupted in applause. In that moment, the story had come full circle. The waitress, who once served tables, now served justice. The lights of Manhattan glowed behind them. The same city that had once ignored their voices now listening intently. In the space between their joined hands, a new legacy had been born, not of money or fame, but of courage, truth, and humanity. And as the screen of this story fades to black, one truth remains clear. Money can buy power, but it can never buy humanity.